The courtroom erupted with shock as Pam Bondi and Joe Rogan took the stand, revealing shocking details about Diddy's secretive past. From underhanded deals to whispered threats, what they shared sent ripples across the media landscape. But what exactly did they expose, and how far will this revelation reach? Let's break down the story in this explosive video. The world of glitz and glamour was about to be rattled to its core. It started as a whisper, a late-night phone call to Joe Rogan's private line from a voice he didn't recognize. The caller spoke in measured, deliberate tones, dropping hints that Diddy, the music mogul revered by millions, was hiding secrets dark enough to topple his empire. Joe, known for his no-nonsense attitude and unwavering curiosity, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. This was no idle rumor. The caller seemed to have access to something substantial. The tip came out of nowhere, like a spark in the dead of night. Joe scribbled down every word as he listened, piecing together fragments of what sounded like a complex web of deceit and manipulation. The voice at the other end of the line warned him that the stakes were high. "This isn't just about money," the caller said. "It's about power. It's about control. If you go public with this, you'd better be ready for the blowback." Joe's mind raced. He'd spent years in the public eye, questioning everything and everyone. But this was different. He felt the weight of what he'd been given. He ended the call, his thoughts a jumble of curiosity and apprehension. He knew he had to verify it, but his gut told him there was fire beneath this smoke. At the same time, Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General with a reputation for taking on the powerful, was quietly preparing her own revelation. Her office was a fortress of calm as she reviewed a thick folder of evidence that had landed on her desk days earlier. She had dealt with countless cases, but the contents of this folder gave her pause. Hidden financial transactions, cryptic messages, and testimonies from voices once loyal to Diddy, it painted a damning picture. Pam knew the stakes. She also knew that if she didn't act, the truth would remain buried. She carefully drafted a statement that would become her opening salvo in court, a meticulous account of the allegations she intended to lay bare. She was calm, composed, and absolutely resolute. If these documents were genuine, they could change everything. Meanwhile, the media was already beginning to churn. Word of an upcoming courtroom appearance by Pam Bondi, with Joe Rogan's name attached, was enough to set journalists' pulses racing. Rumors spread like wildfire, headlines proclaiming the downfall of one of music's biggest icons. No one had the full picture yet, but that only added to the anticipation. Speculation swirled in backrooms and editorial offices. Everyone wanted the scoop. Diddy's legal team, usually so sure-footed, was in overdrive. His top attorney, Michael Jansen, paced his office with an intensity that betrayed the calm exterior he liked to project. He'd received an advance warning that Bondi and Rogan were about to go public. He didn't know what they had, but he knew the threat was real. Every document, every bank record, every offhand comment Diddy had ever made, Jansen combed through it all with surgical precision. They needed to be ready. If even a fraction of what was rumored was true, Diddy's entire career could be at stake. Joe Rogan, for his part, was already thinking about how to frame the story. He was no stranger to controversy, but he knew this was different. It wasn't about conspiracy theories or debates over health supplements. It was about a powerful man whose carefully curated image might be about to shatter. Joe pored over the notes from the late-night call, cross-referencing them with everything he could find online. He reached out to contacts he trusted, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. Pam Bondi was similarly methodical. She contacted several key witnesses who had once moved in Diddy's orbit. Some were reluctant, others downright scared. But she had a way of making people talk, of convincing them that the truth mattered more than loyalty to a fading star. Her quiet determination had won over many before, she was counting on it again now. As the date for the court appearance loomed, the world outside the courthouse seemed to hold its breath. Tabloids splashed Diddy's face across their covers, pairing his confident smile with ominous headlines. Social media was a maelstrom of speculation and half-truths, each post more dramatic than the last. It was a feeding frenzy, everyone wanted a piece of the story. Yet for those closest to the drama, the stakes weren't about headlines. Pam Bondi spent sleepless nights reviewing her notes, rehearsing her statement until it was etched in her mind. She knew that once she stepped into that courtroom, there would be no turning back. She was ready. Joe Rogan, meanwhile, balanced the tension with his trademark focus. He knew he would have to face Diddy's team in person, a room full of expensive suits and calculated glares. But he'd done this dance before. He wouldn't be intimidated. He wouldn't be silenced. And Diddy? Diddy kept his cards close to his chest. Publicly, he projected confidence, a polished smile here, a defiant tweet there. But behind closed doors, he wasn't taking any chances. His team worked around the clock, digging up everything they could to discredit Joe and Pam. If he could control the narrative, he believed he could control the outcome. But in that final moment, as Pam Bondi put the finishing touches on her opening remarks and Joe Rogan rehearsed his lines of questioning, the truth was no longer in Diddy's hands. It was out there, a storm waiting to break. The night before the hearing, Pam stood by her office window, the city below glowing in the dark. She knew she wasn't just challenging a man, she was challenging an entire system that let men like Diddy thrive in the shadows. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the battle ahead. Joe Rogan, across town, sat in his studio, microphone off, the glow of his computer screen the only light in the room. He scrolled through the final pieces of evidence he'd managed to gather. He was ready to ask the questions that needed answers, and he was ready to do it in front of the world. The morning would come soon enough. The courtroom doors would open, and the stage would be set. Pam Bondi, Joe Rogan, and Diddy, 3 names, 1 showdown. The world was watching. And the first chapter of this modern drama was about to be written. The courthouse was already alive with energy before dawn. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters jostling for the best vantage point. A cold wind cut through the morning air, but it did little to cool the fevered anticipation. Inside, the courtroom was a study in contrasts, a solemn place of law and order, yet buzzing with an electric undercurrent that hinted at the storm about to break. Pam Bondi arrived first, her stride purposeful as she made her way up the courthouse steps. She wore a tailored navy suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple knot that spoke of business, not vanity. Her expression was calm, her shoulders squared. She had come prepared for war. In her briefcase were the documents she had spent weeks poring over, a labyrinth of bank transfers, shell companies, and coded messages that she believed laid bare Diddy's hidden dealings. Inside the courtroom, she took her seat at the prosecutor's table, her eyes scanning the room. Rows of wooden pews were already filled with journalists and curious onlookers. She could feel the weight of their stares, but she didn't flinch. She had faced bigger crowds before. This was about the truth, not the spectacle. A hush fell over the room as Joe Rogan entered. He cut a striking figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a simple black suit that seemed to accentuate his no-nonsense presence. A murmur rippled through the gallery as he took his seat beside Pam. Some of the reporters openly whispered his name, clearly surprised to see the podcaster and cultural icon sitting in a witness role. Joe's eyes met Pam's, and they exchanged a nod, a silent understanding that they were here for the same reason. Diddy entered last, flanked by his legal team. His arrival was marked by the flash of cameras from the press pool in the back of the room, and a sudden hush as people turned to look. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, his expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses he removed only as he stepped to the defense table. Diddy looked every inch the mogul he was known to be, confident, unbothered, and coldly precise in his movements. His lead attorney, Michael Jansen, took a seat beside him, a stack of papers already prepared for what promised to be a long and contentious day. Jansen leaned in to whisper something in Diddy's ear, and the 2 men shared a quick, tight smile. Whatever confidence Diddy projected outwardly, Jansen was the one orchestrating his defense with the precision of a master chess player. The judge entered promptly at 9 o'clock, his black robe sweeping as he took his seat behind the towering bench. "Court is now in session," he announced in a deep voice that immediately cut through the murmur of the crowd. The gavel came down, and with that single crack, the courtroom fell silent. Pam Bondi rose, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, the evidence we are prepared to present will demonstrate a pattern of misconduct that cannot be ignored. We will show how Mr. Combs has, for years, orchestrated a complex network of shell companies and secret transactions to launder money, evade scrutiny, and maintain control through intimidation." A ripple of gasps moved through the room. Diddy sat back, his face impassive, but his fingers drummed on the table in a subtle show of tension. Pam continued, her eyes fixed on the judge. "We will also demonstrate that Mr. Combs engaged in direct efforts to silence those who knew of these activities, using both financial leverage and personal intimidation." The judge listened without reaction, his face a mask of neutrality. When Pam sat down, he turned to Diddy's attorney. "Mr. Jansen, do you have an opening statement?" Jansen stood smoothly, his voice calm and measured. "Your Honor, what we have here is a collection of hearsay, conjecture, and half-truths masquerading as fact. My client has built a career through hard work and innovation, and he categorically denies these allegations. We will show that the so-called evidence presented today is nothing more than an attempt to tarnish his name and damage his reputation. Joe Rogan shifted slightly in his seat as Jansen spoke, his eyes narrowing. He knew that charm and polish could sway a room, but he also knew that the truth had a way of cutting through the noise. The judge looked over his glasses at the courtroom. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice firm. "This is a place of law and order. There will be no outbursts, no attempts to influence this proceeding from the gallery. The evidence will be heard, and only the evidence will speak." Pam Bondi rose again, her first witness already prepared. She called a forensic accountant to the stand, a mild-mannered man in a gray suit who carried the air of someone who spent more time with spreadsheets than in courtrooms. His testimony was dry but devastating, a careful, methodical walkthrough of the shell companies and the money that flowed through them like water down a hidden channel. Joe listened intently, making notes in a small leather notebook. His presence wasn't just as a passive observer. He was there to testify, to put on record what he knew and what he had been told. He glanced at Pam, who sat forward in her chair, every fiber of her body focused on the accountant's testimony. Diddy watched the proceedings with an air of detached calm. His lawyer's hand rested on his arm occasionally, a quiet reminder to maintain the facade. But to those who looked closely, there was a flicker of something deeper in Diddy's eyes, a calculation, perhaps, or the first hint of worry. As the forensic accountant stepped down, the judge called for a short recess. The courtroom buzzed with a low murmur as people stretched and whispered, trading theories in hushed tones. Pam Bondi walked over to Joe, her expression thoughtful. "They're going to fight this with everything they've got," she said quietly. Joe nodded. "Let them. We're not here to play games." She managed a tight smile. "No. We're here to end them." When court reconvened, the judge called Joe Rogan to the stand. There was an audible intake of breath as he rose and walked to the witness box. His presence was electric, the host of a show known for asking the tough questions, now facing some of the toughest he'd ever answered. Joe swore to tell the truth, his deep voice carrying clearly through the room. Pam stepped forward, her questions precise and deliberate. She asked about the mysterious phone call he'd received, about the files that had been sent to him by sources he trusted implicitly. Joe answered with calm precision, each word a small nail in the coffin of Diddy's carefully managed image. As he spoke, the tension in the room was palpable. Even the reporters who had been typing feverishly paused to listen. Joe's testimony wasn't just about the facts, it was about the power of a voice that refused to be silenced. Diddy's legal team shifted uncomfortably. Jansen's pen tapped against the desk, a sign that the questions were cutting closer than he liked. And as Joe finished, the judge gave a brief nod. "Thank you, Mr. Rogan," he said. "We will continue with this case after lunch recess." The gavel fell again, but the echoes of that morning's testimony lingered in the air. The showdown had truly begun, and there would be no turning back. The afternoon air outside the courthouse was brisk and biting, but inside, the tension felt almost suffocating. When the court reconvened, there was a sense of anticipation so thick it was almost a physical force. Reporters had barely returned to their seats, still breathless from racing to file lunchtime updates. Social media buzzed with every word that had been spoken, and every camera in the room was trained on Pam Bondi as she prepared to present the day's most anticipated evidence, the secret files. Pam Bondi stood, her posture calm, almost regal in its confidence. She walked to the bench with a single folder in her hand, slim, but weighty with significance. She paused, holding the room's attention for a moment that felt suspended in time. Then, with deliberate care, she placed the folder on the table in front of her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "What I have here are documents that, if authentic, show a deliberate pattern of financial manipulation and criminal activity orchestrated by Mr. Combs. These files were provided to me by multiple confidential sources and have been verified, to the best of our ability, as genuine." The judge leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. "Proceed, Ms. Bondi." Pam carefully opened the folder, revealing pages filled with columns of transactions, coded language, and signatures that hinted at powerful names. She held up the first document, a bank transfer record showing large sums of money moving through offshore accounts linked to Diddy's various business ventures. "This," she said, "is a record of a wire transfer from a holding company in the Cayman Islands to a shell corporation in Panama. The amount, $5 million, was moved in a single day, without any legitimate business justification. She handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom was utterly silent as the judge's eyes scanned the page, the faint scratch of his pen as he made a note the only sound. Pam moved on to the next document, a signed letter, written in coded phrases, that seemed to link Diddy to the movement of these funds. Your Honor, this letter was obtained from a secure source, a former associate of Mr. Combs who has since come forward. In it, there are repeated references to the arrangement and ensuring silence. We believe this is a veiled reference to the deals being discussed today. Joe Rogan sat forward slightly, his face a mask of focus. He had seen these files days before, but hearing them read aloud, in the sterile gravity of the courtroom, gave them new weight. He exchanged a brief look with Pam. They both knew the storm that was coming. Diddy's lawyer, Michael Jansen, was already on his feet. Objection, Your Honor, he said smoothly. These documents have not been authenticated by an independent forensic expert. They are, at best, circumstantial and at worst, forgeries designed to smear my client's name. The judge held up a hand. I will allow the documents to be entered into the record for review. Mr. Jansen, you will have your chance to question the authenticity. But for now, the court will hear them. Pam continued, presenting each document with clinical precision. Each page she revealed seemed to add another layer to the allegations, payments to anonymous consultants, messages instructing intermediaries to keep everything quiet, and curious gaps in official company records that hinted at deliberate obfuscation. The final piece of evidence she presented was a single page of handwritten notes, scrawled hastily in the margins of a legal pad. These notes, she said, were provided by a source who claims they were written by Mr. Combs himself. They reference a meeting to fix the problem and mention names that are directly connected to these shell companies. As the judge reviewed the page, the courtroom buzzed with quiet intensity. Diddy sat motionless, his expression cool and detached, but his fingers tapped a restless beat on the table in front of him. It was a small, almost imperceptible tell, a crack in the carefully constructed facade. Joe Rogan was then called back to the stand, this time to confirm what he had seen and heard. He stood, his voice steady as he recounted how he had been sent a nearly identical set of files by a trusted source, someone who had worked with Diddy's team in the past and had grown disillusioned by what they saw. The files I received, Joe said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, matched the ones Ms. Bondi has presented here today. They came with a warning that if I didn't share them, the truth would be buried forever. Pam nodded slightly, her eyes reflecting the resolve they shared. Did you feel threatened by what you saw, Mr. Rogan? She asked. Joe hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing. Not threatened, but I knew it was dangerous. When you're dealing with someone who has as much power and influence as Diddy, the risks are real. But the truth doesn't go away just because you're scared of it. Jansen rose, his expression calm but his eyes hard. Mr. Rogan, he began, how can you be sure that these files are genuine? You said yourself that they came from a trusted source, but do you have any expertise in verifying financial records? Joe met his gaze squarely. I don't need to be an accountant to know that these aren't just rumors. I've spoken to the people who lived this story, and I trust the people who trusted me with it. The courtroom fell quiet again. The judge made a note, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Mr. Rogan, he said. You may step down. As Joe returned to his seat, the weight of what had just been shared hung heavy in the air. The judge announced another short recess, the gavel's echo still reverberating long after he left the bench. Outside the courthouse, the media was in a frenzy. Reporters clutched their notepads and pushed their microphones forward, desperate for any scrap of commentary. Social media feeds lit up with the details, hashtags trending in real time as the world digested every revelation. Inside, Pam Bondi closed the folder and exhaled slowly. This was the moment she had been preparing for, and she knew that the battle was far from over. But for the first time, the truth was no longer locked away in shadows. It was here, in the light of the courtroom, where it could no longer be ignored. Diddy's gaze was fixed on her, cold and unblinking. There was no more charm, no more carefully managed persona. Just a man staring down the possibility of ruin, and the woman who dared to bring it all into the open. When the court reconvened, there was an almost tangible shift in the room's atmosphere. Pam Bondi and Joe Rogan had presented their case with precision, but now it was Diddy's turn to push back. His lawyer, Michael Jansen, stood at the defense table, his expression calm and steely. He looked every inch the consummate professional, ready to disassemble the case that had been so carefully built against his client. Your Honor, Jansen began, his voice a measured baritone that carried across the hushed courtroom. We appreciate the gravity of these allegations, but we categorically reject them as false and malicious. My client, Mr. Combs, has built a reputation as a businessman and philanthropist. What has been presented here today is a house of cards, built on innuendo and conjecture. Pam Bondi watched him impassively, her face an unreadable mask. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But still, Jansen's confidence had a way of filling the room, making every word feel like a final declaration. Jansen walked slowly to the center of the room, holding a sheaf of papers. We will show that the so-called secret files are nothing more than a collection of incomplete documents, taken out of context and manipulated to tell a story that simply isn't true. He paused, letting the words sink in. Furthermore, we have our own set of records, verified by independent experts, which contradict the narrative Ms. Bondi has put forth. He handed a stack of glossy folders to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge. In these records, Your Honor, you will find legitimate business transactions, properly documented and legally sound. There is no money laundering, no illegal movement of funds, only standard transactions for a global enterprise. Joe Rogan shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the tactic: flood the courtroom with technical details, cast doubt on every piece of evidence. It was a classic defense strategy, and one that could be devastating if executed well. Jansen wasn't done. He turned to Joe, his eyes cold and calculating. Mr. Rogan, he said, you claim to have been sent these files by a trusted source. But can you provide any verification of that source's credibility? Or are we simply to take your word for it? Joe met his gaze without blinking. I stand by what I said. The files came from someone who knows what's in them. I'm not here to lie. Jansen arched an eyebrow. But you're not a financial expert, Mr. Rogan. You're a commentator. A podcaster. How can you claim to understand the complexities of these transactions? Joe's lips twitched in a faint smile. You're right, I'm not an accountant. But I know when something doesn't add up. And I know when people are afraid to tell the truth. The judge interjected. Mr. Jansen, focus on the evidence. Jansen nodded, though the faint smirk on his lips betrayed his satisfaction. He returned to the defense table and retrieved another document. Your Honor, this is a signed affidavit from one of Mr. Combs' financial advisors. It explicitly states that the transactions Ms. Bondi has described were fully legal and above board. There is no secret network. There is no conspiracy. He handed the document to the judge. The room fell silent as the judge read, the tension stretching taut as a wire. Pam Bondi rose, her voice as calm as ever. Your Honor, I would like to remind the court that affidavits are not conclusive evidence. We have documents, real, verifiable transactions, that tell a different story. And we have witnesses who are prepared to testify to the threats and intimidation they faced when they tried to speak up. Diddy's gaze was fixed on her, his expression still and inscrutable. But in the set of his jaw, there was a flicker of something else, anger, perhaps, or the first hint of desperation. The courtroom watched as Jansen and Pam Bondi went back and forth in a series of rapid-fire exchanges. Each word was a carefully placed chess piece, each statement designed to outmaneuver the other. Joe Rogan sat back, observing the duel with a podcaster's keen eye. He knew the real battle wasn't just in the words, it was in the way they were delivered, the way they were believed. Finally, the judge called for Diddy to take the stand. The room shifted, the air electric as the music mogul rose. He walked slowly to the witness box, his movements deliberate. When he took his seat, he didn't look at Pam or Joe. He looked straight ahead, his face the picture of cold control. Jansen began with a series of gentle questions, painting Diddy as a legitimate businessman, a man who had worked his way to the top through hard work and talent. Diddy's answers were calm, his voice smooth and measured. He denied any knowledge of the allegations, his tone never wavering. Then it was Pam's turn. She stood, her questions direct and piercing. Mr. Combs, she said, her voice sharp as a blade, have you ever authorized payments to individuals or companies for the purpose of concealing your business activities? No, Diddy said evenly. All of my business dealings are transparent and legal. Have you ever threatened someone to ensure their silence? No, he said again, his gaze unwavering. Pam held up the handwritten notes she had presented earlier. Can you explain why your name appears in these notes, alongside phrases like fix the problem and no more leaks? Diddy leaned back slightly.
I can't comment on notes I didn't write.
I have no idea what they are referring to.
Pam didn't blink.
So you deny ever being involved in any activity designed to hide financial misconduct? Diddy's lips curved in a faint, dismissive smile.
Absolutely. I'm a businessman.
I don't operate in the shadows. The judge watched silently, his pen moving steadily as he took notes. Joe Rogan, sitting just feet away, felt a flicker of something like frustration. Diddy was good, too good. Every answer was calm, controlled, rehearsed.
He knew how to play the room.
When Diddy stepped down from the witness box, the courtroom was buzzing with energy. Jansen looked pleased, his expression smug.
But Pam wasn't deterred.
She knew the next phase of the trial would be the turning point, the moment when the witnesses would step forward, when the voices who had been silenced would finally be heard. As court adjourned for the day, Joe caught Pam's eye. She gave him a small, grim smile.
"He's good," she said quietly.
Joe nodded.
"Yeah.
But the truth is better." And as they walked out of the courthouse together, past the flashing cameras and the shouting reporters, they both knew that the battle was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new voices, new evidence, and maybe, finally, the cracks in Diddy's armor would begin to show. The morning after Diddy's testimony, the courthouse was surrounded by a sea of flashing cameras and clamoring voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward in search of any soundbite that would fuel the next headline. The story had already transcended the courtroom, becoming a national obsession that played out in real time on screens large and small. As Pam Bondi and Joe Rogan made their way up the courthouse steps, the questions came at them like a barrage. Pam, how do you respond to Diddy's denial? Joe, are you worried about retaliation? Do you have more evidence coming? Neither of them paused to answer. Their focus was on the courtroom, the only place where the truth could be spoken without interruption. Inside, the media presence was even more pronounced. The gallery was packed with journalists from every major outlet, their fingers poised over keyboards, ready to record every word. Social media had become a battlefield of hashtags and hot takes, #DiddyTrial, #Pam vs Diddy, #Joe Rogan reveals. The allegations had become the top story everywhere, not just on the evening news, but on podcasts, TikTok, and message boards. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted to be the first to break the next piece of the story. Pam Bondi took her seat at the prosecutor's table, a quiet calm in the eye of the media storm. She knew that the courtroom was the only place she could control the narrative. Outside, it was a feeding frenzy of speculation and rumor. Inside, she had evidence and the law on her side. Joe Rogan, sitting beside her, glanced down at his phone during a brief pause. His social media notifications were a blur of support and skepticism, each new alert a reminder of just how much was at stake. He had been in the public eye for years, but never like this. This was bigger than a podcast or a viral clip. This was about real people and real consequences. Across the aisle, Diddy's team was working just as hard to shape the narrative. Michael Jansen, his lawyer, had spent the night crafting a carefully worded statement for the press. That morning, Diddy's publicist read it aloud to the waiting cameras, a dismissive smile playing at the corners of his lips. "These allegations are baseless and defamatory," the statement read. "Mr. Combs is confident that the truth will prevail and that these attempts to damage his reputation will be seen for what they are, a desperate bid for attention from those who have none." It was a calculated move, one that played well with Diddy's loyal fans. Online, supporters rallied behind him, flooding comment sections with hashtags like #InnocentUntilProvenGuilty and #StandWithDiddy. But there were others, too, voices that had been waiting for years to see someone challenge the man behind the music. The narrative was splintering, and no one could predict where it would end. Inside the courtroom, Pam called her next witness, a former financial analyst who had worked for one of Diddy's holding companies. His hands trembled slightly as he took the stand, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Joe recognized the look, the fear of someone who knew too much. "Please state your name for the record," Pam said. "My name is Thomas Grant," the man replied, his voice low but steady. Pam began with gentle questions, coaxing out the details of his job and his role in the financial structure of Diddy's empire. Slowly, methodically, she drew out the story. How money had moved through layers of shell companies, how payments had been made to consultants with no clear purpose, how anyone who asked questions was quickly silenced or pushed out. Jansen objected frequently, his voice calm but urgent, trying to disrupt the flow of testimony. But the judge overruled him time and again, determined to let the witness speak. As Thomas spoke, the room was utterly silent. Even the reporters paused, their fingers hovering over their keyboards as they listened to each word. Joe watched, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment when the case shifted, when speculation turned to something undeniable. Pam leaned in, her voice soft but insistent. "Mr. Grant, did you ever feel threatened because of what you knew?" Thomas hesitated, his eyes flicking to Diddy for the briefest moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I was warned not to talk. They told me it would be the end of my career if I ever spoke out." Pam let that hang in the air for a moment before moving on. She knew the power of silence, of letting the weight of a statement settle before the next question. Outside the courtroom, the media had latched onto every word. News outlets posted live updates, each new revelation sparking another round of speculation. Talk shows debated the trial in real time, the hosts trading barbs and soundbites. Social media was a frenzy, memes, theories, and conspiracies multiplying by the second. Pam and Joe knew that the real battle was inside these four walls, but they couldn't ignore the power of the world outside. Every word spoken here would echo far beyond the courtroom. At the end of the day, as Thomas Grant stepped down, the judge called for an adjournment. The room erupted in a flurry of noise as reporters rushed to file their stories, the headlines practically writing themselves. Pam Bondi gathered her notes, her expression thoughtful. "Tomorrow," she said quietly to Joe, "we bring in the witness who saw it all." Joe nodded, his eyes tired but resolute. "Let them have their headlines tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we show them the truth." As they left the courthouse, the media surged forward, their questions a deafening roar.
Pam didn't answer. Joe didn't pause.
They had given the world enough for today.
But even as they walked away, they knew the story was no longer theirs alone.
It belonged to everyone, the journalists, the fans, the cynics and the true believers.
It was a media frenzy that had taken on a life of its own.
And in that swirling chaos, one thing was clear. The fight for the truth was only just beginning. The next morning, a hush settled over the courthouse as word spread that a surprise witness was about to take the stand. Rumors had swirled overnight. Some claimed it was a former business partner of Diddy's, others a disillusioned member of his inner circle. Whoever it was, one thing was clear. The next chapter of this trial would be explosive. Pam Bondi arrived early, her expression focused and calm. She had spent the night preparing for this moment, cross-checking every detail, rehearsing every question. She knew that what was about to happen could change everything. Joe Rogan was already there, leaning against the wall of the courtroom lobby, his phone in his hand. His social media feeds were a blur of speculation and commentary, but he ignored them. Today wasn't about the outside world, it was about the words that would be spoken in this room. When the court came to order, the judge looked out over the packed gallery, his expression grave. "The prosecution may call its next witness," he said. Pam Bondi stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Mr. Marcus Reed."
A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom.
Marcus Reed had once been one of Diddy's closest confidants, a man who had built a reputation as a fixer, the one who made problems go away. For years, he had operated in the shadows, his name never mentioned but his influence felt in every corner of Diddy's empire. As Marcus took the stand, the room seemed to lean forward, every eye fixed on him. He was a tall man, his face lined and serious. His eyes, usually hidden behind dark glasses, were steady as he looked out over the room. He took a deep breath before speaking, as if steeling himself for what was to come. "Please state your name for the record," Pam said. "Marcus Reed," he replied, his voice deep and measured.
Pam wasted no time.
"Mr. Reed, can you tell the court what your role was within Mr. Combs' organization?"
"I was an advisor," Marcus said carefully.
"I handled certain negotiations, certain arrangements." "And what do you mean by arrangements?" Pam pressed, her voice calm but insistent. Marcus hesitated, his gaze flicking briefly to where Diddy sat, impassive and silent. "I mean, I was the one who made sure the money kept moving. The one who kept the people who asked too many questions quiet." A stunned silence settled over the courtroom. Even the reporters paused, their pens hovering in the air. Pam took a step closer. "Mr. Reed, can you be more specific? What exactly did you do to keep people quiet?" Marcus swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "I paid them off. Oh, I made sure they understood the consequences if they didn't stay quiet." Joe Rogan sat forward, his eyes locked on Marcus. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the confirmation that everything they had uncovered wasn't just rumor. but fact.
Pam's voice was steady.
And these payments, were they authorized by Mr. Combs? Marcus nodded once, his face a mask of quiet determination.
Yes.
Every payment, every threat, it all came from the top. Across the aisle, Diddy's lawyer was on his feet in an instant. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay and conjecture, with no supporting documentation. The judge held up a hand, his expression stern. Mr. Jansen, you will have the opportunity to cross-examine. For now, let the witness speak. Pam continued, her questions precise. Mr. Reed, did you personally witness Mr. Combs ordering these actions? Marcus took a breath, his shoulders straightening. Yes. I was in the room. I heard him say, "Make this go away."
And I did. A low murmur swept through the courtroom.
Diddy sat frozen, his face a mask of studied calm. But Joe saw the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of his eyes, small signs that the mask was cracking. Pam moved to her final question. Mr. Reed, why are you coming forward now? Marcus looked down for a moment, his voice quiet when he spoke.
Because I'm tired of the lies.
I'm tired of carrying the weight of what we did. People deserve to know the truth.
The judge nodded.
Mr. Jansen, you may cross-examine. Jansen rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He walked to the stand, his expression mild. Mr. Reed, he said, his voice soft, you claim to have been involved in illegal activities. Are you here today to save yourself from prosecution?
Marcus met his gaze without flinching.
I'm here to tell the truth. Jansen smiled faintly. The truth?
Or your version of it?
He paused, then leaned closer. Mr. Reed, isn't it true that you were forced out of Mr. Combs' organization? That you have a personal vendetta against him?
Marcus didn't blink.
I was forced out because I stopped being useful.
But this isn't about revenge.
It's about the truth. Jansen's smile faded. He knew the damage was done, but he pressed on, trying to chip away at Marcus's credibility. Mr. Reed, do you have any documentation to back up your claims? Any emails, any written orders from Mr. Combs?
Marcus shook his head slowly. No. We didn't put those things in writing. But I was there. I saw it all.
For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then Jansen stepped back. No further questions. The judge looked at Marcus, his expression thoughtful. You may step down. As Marcus left the stand, the room was buzzing. Reporters scribbled furiously, their eyes wide with the weight of what they had just heard.
Joe Rogan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew this was the moment that would shift the trial forever.
Pam Bondi gathered her papers, her expression calm but resolute. She knew that Marcus's testimony was a turning point, the moment when the shadows had been pulled back and the truth laid bare for everyone to see. Outside, the media was already in a frenzy, headlines exploding with words like bombshell and explosive. Social media lit up, the hashtags trending globally within minutes. Joe could see the buzz on his phone, but he didn't care. For him, it wasn't about the noise, it was about the moment when truth found its voice. And in that moment, as Marcus Reed walked out of the courtroom, head held high, Joe knew that everything had changed. The witness who had lived in the shadows was now center stage, and nothing, not even Diddy's money or power, could silence what he had seen. The courthouse was a hive of whispers and speculation as the trial moved into its final stages. Marcus Reed's testimony had cracked open a door no one could close, and the world was watching with bated breath to see what would come next. The next day, the courtroom was standing room only, the press gallery overflowing, and every word spoken was instantly beamed across a world hungry for the next revelation. Pam Bondi stood at the front of the courtroom, her presence calm and commanding. She had waited for this moment, the closing argument that would lay bare everything she and Joe had fought to bring into the light. She rose, her notes in hand, and turned to face the judge and the sea of faces watching her every move. Your Honor, she began, her voice strong and clear, what we have shown here is not speculation, not rumor, but a carefully documented pattern of deception and manipulation. Mr. Combs, through shell companies, coded messages, and the silencing of those who dared to speak out, has built a network designed to hide the truth and protect his power. She paused, letting the words settle over the room like a heavy fog. The evidence is there, in the bank records, in the testimony of those who were closest to him, and in the silences he demanded from those who saw too much. Mr. Marcus Reed's words may have been shocking, but they are not alone. They are the final piece of a puzzle we have laid out before this court, a puzzle that, once assembled, cannot be ignored. Joe Rogan sat forward, his eyes locked on Pam. He knew how carefully she had chosen her words, how deliberately she had built her argument. She wasn't just telling a story, she was revealing the architecture of a lie that had spanned decades. Across the aisle, Diddy's lawyer, Michael Jansen, rose. His expression was calm, but there was a tightness around his eyes that betrayed the strain of the last few days. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we have heard much speculation, much innuendo, but where is the concrete evidence? Yes, there are documents, but none that directly link Mr. Combs to any illegal activity. Yes, there is testimony, but it comes from those with clear motives to harm my client, men and women who stand to gain from his downfall." He turned, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. This case is built on shadows and whispers, on the words of those who want to see a successful man brought low.
But the law is not built on whispers. It is built on facts.
And the facts are clear. Mr. Combs is innocent. The judge listened in silence, his face a mask of calm. But Joe could see the subtle signs, the slight furrow of his brow, the way he leaned forward in his chair. He was weighing every word, every nuance. Finally, it was Joe Rogan's turn to speak. He rose from his seat, his broad shoulders straight, his face set with a quiet resolve. He walked to the front of the courtroom, his voice low but carrying through the room with a calm authority that demanded attention. "I'm not a lawyer," he began, "and I'm not a financial expert. But I am someone who has spent his life asking questions and demanding answers. And when I see people who are scared to speak, people who are threatened or paid off to stay silent, I know that something is wrong."
He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "I don't care about the headlines. I don't care about the drama. I care about the truth."
And what we've seen here isn't just about one man's actions, it's about a culture of silence that has allowed those actions to continue unchecked for years. There was a ripple of quiet murmurs through the gallery, but Joe didn't waver. "We've all heard the words of Marcus Reed. We've seen the documents, the coded messages, the payments to make people disappear. And I know, we all know, that when you add it all together, it doesn't look like a misunderstanding. It looks like a plan." He stepped back, his gaze steady. "I leave it to this court to decide what happens next. But I believe in the power of the truth, and I believe we've finally let it be heard." The judge called for a brief recess, and the room erupted in noise as soon as he stepped away. Reporters scrambled to file updates, cameras flashing, the hum of voices almost deafening. Pam sat beside Joe, her face calm but her eyes bright with determination.
"That was powerful," she said softly.
"You made them listen." Joe gave her a faint smile. "We just had to remind them what's at stake." Across the room, Diddy sat motionless, his expression blank. But Joe saw it, the faint crack in the mask, the tiny tremor in his hands as he picked up a glass of water. The world he had built on carefully managed images was slipping away, one word at a time. When the court reconvened, the judge's expression was unreadable. "This court has heard a great deal of testimony," he said, his voice measured. "The weight of these allegations is considerable, and the evidence presented has raised serious questions that cannot be dismissed lightly."
He paused, his eyes scanning the room.
"Before I render a decision, I will take a short recess to consider the final arguments and the testimony given. I ask that all parties remain available." The gavel came down, and with it, a silence that felt as final as a sentence. Outside, the media was in a frenzy, their voices echoing through the marble halls. But inside, there was a sense of something else, a quiet, breathless anticipation. Pam gathered her files, her hand brushing against Joe's as they stood.
"This is it," she said quietly.
"The moment we've been working for."
Joe nodded.
"Whatever happens next, we've done our part.
We've made sure the truth was heard."
As they walked out of the courtroom, past the crush of reporters and the shouting questions, they didn't stop to answer.
Their job was done, for now. But they both knew that the fight wasn't over. It never was.
Because in the end, the truth didn't care about money or power.
It only cared about being seen.
The final decision came on a gray afternoon that seemed to match the mood of the courthouse. A low fog clung to the city, softening the edges of buildings and muffling the shouts of the reporters gathered outside. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat taken by journalists, spectators, and those who had been part of this extraordinary battle for the truth. Pam Bondi sat at the prosecution table, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She had done everything she could, laid out the evidence, built her case piece by piece. Now it was up to the judge to decide whether it was enough. Joe Rogan sat beside her, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He had spent years asking the hard questions, pushing for answers. But this wasn't a podcast episode or a viral clip. This was real. This was about the truth, and about whether it would finally be heard. Diddy sat across the room, flanked by his legal team. His expression was as inscrutable as ever, his eyes hidden behind tinted glasses even here in the solemn quiet of the courtroom. The mask he wore had cracked in places over the past days, but he had never let it slip completely. He knew that every word spoken in this room was being broadcast to the world outside, every glance, every flicker of expression a potential headline. The judge entered, his black robes flowing, and the room fell instantly silent. He took his seat and regarded the courtroom with a calm, measured expression. "This court has heard serious allegations," he began, his voice deep and steady. "Allegations of financial misconduct, threats, and an orchestrated effort to conceal the truth. We have seen documents, heard testimony, and weighed the words of those who claim to know the inner workings of Mr. Combs' empire." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "The evidence presented here is compelling. It raises serious questions that cannot and should not be ignored. In light of this, I am ordering a full, independent investigation into the financial dealings of Mr. Combs and his companies. This investigation will be conducted by an external body to ensure impartiality and thoroughness." A ripple of reaction swept through the room, some gasps, some hurried whispers. But the judge was not done. "However," he continued, "this court is not in a position to render a criminal verdict today. What we have seen are allegations supported by circumstantial evidence and testimony that, while credible, requires further examination. This is not an acquittal, nor is it a conviction. It is a mandate for the truth to be pursued fully and fearlessly." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the decision was final. Pam Bondi let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Joe placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent show of support. They had done what they came to do. They had cracked open the door, and now the world would have to walk through it. Across the aisle, Diddy remained still. His expression never changed, but his lawyer leaned in close, whispering rapidly in his ear. Diddy gave no sign of what he was thinking, no flicker of relief or fear. But Joe saw the tension in his shoulders, the tight line of his jaw. He knew that this was not the end, that the walls that had protected Diddy for so long were finally beginning to crumble. Outside the courthouse, the media was in a frenzy. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and social media exploded with the news. #Diddy investigation was trending within minutes, the hashtags blending together in a swirl of speculation and half-formed theories. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next, what secrets the investigation would unearth, and what the future would hold for the man who had built an empire on music, money, and mystery. Pam and Joe emerged from the courthouse into the glare of cameras and the roar of questions. They didn't stop to speak. They didn't need to. Their message had already been delivered, not in sound bites, but in testimony and evidence, in the quiet determination that had carried them through each day of the trial. As they stepped away from the courthouse, Pam turned to Joe, her eyes bright but serious. "We did what we had to do," she said quietly. "The rest is out of our hands now." Joe nodded, his jaw set. "Yeah. But we'll be ready for whatever comes next." The two of them walked away together, leaving the chaos of the courthouse behind. The city around them was alive with the story they had helped bring into the light, a story that would continue to unfold, with or without them. In the days that followed, the investigation began in earnest. Forensic accountants combed through records, following the money trail wherever it led. Journalists dug deeper, unearthing connections that had been hidden in plain sight. The headlines shifted from speculation to substance, from rumor to fact. For Diddy, the world he had built was no longer his alone to control. His name, once synonymous with power and influence, was now tied to questions that wouldn't go away. And for those who had long stayed silent, the trial had been a spark, a sign that it was finally safe to speak. Pam Bondi returned to her office, her desk a sea of folders and files. She knew there would be other cases, other battles. But this one had been different, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed lies couldn't stand forever in the face of the truth. Joe Rogan returned to his studio, the familiar glow of the microphone a comfort. But he knew that what he had seen in that courtroom had changed him. It wasn't just about entertainment or debate anymore, it was about shining a light where others feared to look. In the end, the story of Diddy's hidden empire wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about the power of voices raised together, about the courage it took to stand up and speak out. And as the investigation unfolded and the truth continued to emerge, one thing became clear. No matter how high the walls of power were built, the truth had a way of finding its way through the cracks.